The House of Lords had never been so full. Beneath its painted dome and smoke-darkened cherubs, nobles whispered behind gloved hands as if the devil himself had come to give testimony. They had not gathered to debate war or taxes. No, today's scandal was of softer flesh and sharper tongues. The Duke of Ashbourne had petitioned Parliament for divorce, invoking an act so rare and ruinous that half the city's drawing rooms were already perfumed with gossip. In a corner balcony, the ladies of the ton leaned forward like vultures in silk, their fans fluttering to hide delighted smiles. It was whispered that the Duchess had grown indecently plump, that her gown strained at the seams, that she no longer represented the grace befitting her husband's name. And in that echoing hall, beneath the burnished glare of chandeliers, Lady Eleanor stood alone to hear her worth debated like property. She wore pale lavender, the color of mourning, though no one had died but her dignity. The fabric clung slightly at the waist, betraying a softness that society could not forgive. Her face, once the envy of London, remained serene. Only the faint quiver of her gloved hand betrayed the tremor within. The Lord Chancellor's voice rang through the chamber, droning the legal language of dissolution. Yet all Eleanor heard was the low murmur of pity and the scrape of quills recording her ruin. Across the aisle, her husband sat upright, his profile as cold and perfect as a coin freshly struck. Duke Henry Ashbourne, 35, immaculate and merciless in restraint, had not looked at her once. Years ago he had adored her laughter, her curiosity, her untamed joy. Now he would not meet her eyes. Between them stretched a silence wide as an ocean. A decade of marriage had weathered them. Her miscarriages, his impatience, his mother's whispered cruelties that a duchess should never weep over empty cradles. When Eleanor's grief turned inward, her appetite became her rebellion. Small comforts stolen in solitude, a rebellion paid for in flesh. The ton noticed. And so did Henry, whose pride bruised easier than his heart. A question was asked, whether the Duke sought freedom on the grounds of physical alteration unbecoming to his expectations. He rose. His voice, cultured and deliberate, echoed like a gavel. My household cannot function under deceit. The woman I married no longer exists. The words fell like frost. A few lords shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in solemn agreement as if cruelty were order restored. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, not to defend herself, but in disbelief that she had loved such a man. Her lawyer rose, murmuring something about medical frailty, but the court was deaf to compassion. Scandal, after all, was the empire's favorite entertainment. From the gallery, Henry's mother watched with satisfaction. The dowager Duchess, elegant as a relic, tightened her fingers on her cane. For years she had resented Eleanor's common birth, her warmth, her unmeasured laughter. A duchess, she believed, should be as pale and perfect as marble, not warm-blooded, not imperfectly human. Outside, rain lashed the windows of Westminster, turning the world gray. Eleanor imagined it washing away her shame, the whispers, the stares. In that moment she understood that silence could be armor. She would not plead for a heart already buried. "Do you wish to make any statement, Your Grace?" the Chancellor asked. Eleanor curtsied slowly. "Only this," she said, her voice steady as rain. "A man's pride may fill his halls, but it will never fill his arms." A ripple went through the chamber. Henry's jaw tightened. Even the dowager's fan stilled. The vote was swift. Quills scratched, seals dripped wax, and within the hour the Duchess of Ashbourne was no more. When the court dismissed, Eleanor stepped into the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the marble like the tolling of a distant bell. Her maid hurried to her side, clutching a cloak. "My lady." "Not lady any longer," Eleanor murmured, wrapping the cloak tighter. "Just Eleanor." A carriage awaited outside, black lacquer gleaming wet beneath the gas lamps. As she descended the steps, a crowd gathered, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. Some whispered prayers, others insults. One young girl, perhaps a debutante of 17, stared at her with pity. Eleanor managed a small smile. The girl blushed and looked away. Inside the carriage, the world blurred into a moving watercolor of rain and gaslight. Eleanor pressed her palm against her abdomen, where a faint, secret flutter stirred beneath the corset's pressure. Her breath caught. She had felt it for days, the delicate reassurance that life persisted, stubborn and silent. "You will not know shame," she whispered. "You will not inherit his pride." Back in the chamber, Henry lingered alone. The Parliament was empty now, save for the echo of his own footsteps. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of unease. The satisfaction he had expected did not come. He should have felt lighter, freer. Instead, the silence pressed against him like guilt in physical form. His mother entered quietly, her expression sharp as polished steel. "It is done," she said. "Yes." She was unfit. "You did what duty required." Henry nodded, but his eyes lingered on the seat where Eleanor had stood, so still, so proud, her chin raised against a hall that wished to see her collapse. For a moment, a memory rose unbidden, her laughter on their wedding morning, sunlight catching in her hair. He crushed it before it could soften him. "Duty," he repeated, though the word felt bitter on his tongue. As the Ashbourne crest carriage rolled away through the rain, the dowager turned her gaze toward the mist beyond Westminster. "You will remarry," she said. "An heir must come, Henry. The name cannot end with you." He exhaled through his nose, sharp and weary. "Yes, mother." Yet in some unguarded chamber of his mind, he saw Eleanor again, not as she was today but as she had been, laughing in a garden of lilacs, her skirts stained with earth from planting the rosebush she'd said would outlive them both. That night, London did not sleep. The scandal raced faster than the mail coaches. By morning, caricatures of the portly Duchess were sold on Fleet Street, and gossip became gospel. Few noticed the coach that took the road south toward the cliffs of Devon, carrying a woman who had lost everything but grace. Inside that carriage, Eleanor sat awake while dawn crept pale over the horizon. The rain had stopped, leaving the world cleansed and cold. She drew a letter from her reticule, one she had written but never sent, addressed to "my husband." The ink had bled slightly where her tears had fallen. She read it once more, softly, the words trembling between confession and farewell. When the carriage halted before the sea, she tucked the letter into a locket, closed it over her heart, and whispered to the unseen child, "He shall never know what he cast away." Far behind her, in the grey sprawl of London, Henry woke before dawn to a silence that felt like loss. He stared at the empty half of his bed and for the first time, wondered if perfection had a price too cruel to pay. And in Devon, under a pale sky salted with gulls, the woman he'd abandoned pressed her palm to her belly once more, this time not in grief but in promise. The child moved. The wind that swept Devon's cliffs carried the scent of salt and heather, sharp and alive. Lady Eleanor Ashbourne, no title now, no jewels, no husband, stood before the sea with her cloak drawn tight, her hair loosened by the gale. Behind her, the old manor she had been granted as part of the divorce settlement loomed in faded grandeur, its windows filmed with dust and memory. Inside, the servants had dwindled to two, Anne, the loyal maid, and Mrs. Holt, a kindly cook with arthritic hands. Yet for all its emptiness, the place breathed freedom. No one here whispered about her waistline. No one compared her smile to some younger debutante's. Here, for the first time in years, Eleanor could weep without audience or applause. At her writing desk overlooking the moor, she began a habit that would come to define her days. Each morning she took up her quill and wrote a letter to the man she once called husband. Letters never sent, folded neatly into a lacquered box. She did not write to plead but to remember. "My dearest Henry," one began, "I have discovered that silence has a sound. It is the ticking of clocks that no longer measure love, only absence." She paused, touched the small swell beneath her bodice and added softly, "Yet within me something grows that defies your decree. The heart you declared unworthy beats still." The days passed like chapters of a slow novel. Devon's rain came often and without ceremony, drumming softly upon the glass while Eleanor read by candlelight. Sometimes she wandered the orchards in her shawl, her steps careful upon moss-slick stone. The villagers regarded her with quiet curiosity, some pitied her, others whispered that she had been wronged by prideful London. When she walked through the market square, mothers lowered their eyes in sympathy. The world, in its strange arithmetic, always measured women by what men had said of them. One afternoon, while sorting through the estate's library, Eleanor found an old volume of Psalms. Between its pages lay a wilted rose, pressed flat as memory. She remembered planting roses with Henry in their first year of marriage, his laughter echoing through the garden as she teased him for his meticulousness. The recollection caught her off guard. She closed the book, heart aching with something that was not love, not hatred, but the hollow that remains when both have been exhausted. As the weeks grew into months, her body changed with quiet defiance. Beneath her high-waisted gowns, the curve of pregnancy began to show. When she first told Mrs. Holt, the old woman clasped her hands and whispered, "God sends miracles in disguise, ma'am." But to Eleanor the child was both miracle and reproach. Each night, she felt the small movements within and wondered what kind of father Henry would have been, stern, distant, proud, or perhaps softer, if fate had granted him humility. "You will never know his temper," she whispered one night by the hearth, "nor his loneliness. You shall inherit neither." In London, the world continued to turn without her. Henry's days were consumed by duty and distraction. He attended Parliament debates on the war in Spain, dinners at Brooks's, and endless conversations about trade and taxation. Yet gossip clung to him like damp fog. The Tun had grown cruelly fascinated with his divorce, its echoes refusing to fade. At every ball, he caught the same sly looks, the same murmured phrases, "Poor Duchess," thrown away like a worn glove. A young viscount, emboldened by wine, once remarked, "She was not fat, you know. She was with child." The laughter that followed was thin, uneasy. Henry's hand tightened around his glass until it cracked. He left the gathering without a word. At home, the Dowager Duchess saw his distraction and mistook it for longing of the flesh. "You must remarry," she urged, arranging the profiles of eligible young ladies like military formations. "A man cannot live without a proper duchess." Henry smiled faintly, weary. "And yet I seem to manage," he said. But that night, in his study, he opened his desk drawer and drew out an old miniature portrait, the one painted in their second year of marriage. Eleanor in pale blue silk, her eyes soft, her mouth curved in laughter. The sight unsettled him. He shut the portrait away and poured himself another drink, convincing himself that memory was merely habit. Winter set in. The sea turned gray and violent, flinging its spray against Eleanor's windows. Her letters grew longer, more reflective. "The world believes I am ruined," she wrote, "but I find ruin more honest than reputation. Reputation is built by others. Ruin is one's own." She began to paint again, seascapes mostly, skies torn between storm and light. Each brushstroke steadied her heart. When she walked the shore, she imagined the waves as messengers, carrying her unsent words somewhere he might never read them but might, by some divine irony, feel them. One evening a carriage arrived at the estate. Eleanor, startled, met the visitor in the drawing-room, a portly vicar from the neighboring parish. He had come, he said, to confirm details for a baptism. "A child born last month at the cottage near the chapel. Mrs. Holt mentioned it," he explained, smiling warmly. "It is rare joy in these dark times." Eleanor realized he had mistaken her servant's words. The child had not yet been born. Still, she felt tears prick her eyes. "Not yet, Reverend," she said softly. "But soon." He blessed her and left her with a promise. Every birth is a sermon against despair. That night she went into labor early. The storm outside seemed to echo her cries, the thunder rolling as if the heavens themselves bore witness. Hours passed in pain and prayer until, as dawn broke pale over the moor, the wail of a newborn filled the room. Mrs. Holt wept, whispering, "A boy, my lady, a strong boy." Eleanor, drenched in tears and exhaustion, reached for him. "Edward," she murmured, the name trembling from her lips. "Edward Henry Ashbourne." She kissed his brow, breathing the scent of new life mingled with salt air. "You shall never beg for love, my son. You shall inherit what he denied you, tenderness." Far away in London, the same dawn light slipped through the curtains of the Duke's study. Henry sat awake, unable to sleep. He had dreamed of rain and a child's laughter, though he had no reason to know why. He rose, poured himself tea, and opened his morning correspondence. Among the invitations and petitions lay a small envelope sealed with lavender wax. No name, only a Devon address in delicate handwriting. He frowned, recognizing it instinctively. Eleanor's hand. He hesitated, then, hearing his mother's footsteps in the corridor, slipped it unopened into his pocket. He told himself it was better not to read. The past was a wound best left closed. At noon, the Dowager summoned him to luncheon. She spoke of estate matters and political alliances while he answered mechanically, his thoughts adrift. When the meal ended, he reached into his pocket for the envelope, but it was gone. Perhaps it had fallen on the carriage steps, or perhaps some servant had taken it by mistake. Either way, the letter vanished into the city's oblivion, as so many truths did. In Devon, Eleanor lay awake, the newborn sleeping beside her. The candle burned low. She reached for a quill to write one final note, though her hand trembled with fatigue. "To my son's father," she began, "the world will never tell you, but you have an heir." The ink blurred where her tears fell. She folded the page and placed it in the same box as the others. Outside, the tide receded, leaving the sand glistening under the rising sun, a world cleansed, waiting. In London, Henry stepped into his carriage just as rain began to fall again, gentle and persistent. He looked toward the gray horizon and thought, inexplicably, of the sea. The years turned quietly, like pages in a book no one read aloud. Devon's storms softened into seasons of peace. Within the manor by the sea, laughter returned in small, hesitant echoes, the laughter of a child. Edward Henry Ashbourne, 4 years old, had hair the color of his mother's chestnut curls and eyes too sharp, too solemn for his tender age. Sometimes when he watched the waves, Eleanor felt her heart twist. He had his father's gaze, that cool gray-blue reflective as steel. Yet where Henry's had judged, Edward's only wondered. He asked about everything: the ships beyond the horizon, the bells that tolled from the chapel, the meaning of words like Duke, which Mrs. Holt sometimes whispered when she thought Eleanor could not hear. "Was my father brave?" he asked one afternoon, chasing sunlight across the garden wall. Eleanor paused mid-stitch, her needle trembling slightly. "He was proud," she said at last. "And sometimes pride looks like bravery, though it rarely is." The boy nodded, accepting it as truth. He was gentle, curious, fiercely affectionate. Every kiss on his brow felt to her like both a blessing and a debt she would never finish repaying. Beyond Devon, the world roared again with war. Newspapers spoke of the Duke of Ashbourne as a man reborn. His speeches in Parliament carried weight, his estates flourished, his mother's influence spreading like ivy. Yet those who knew him privately saw something altered. He no longer attended every ball. He had grown restless, wandering from meeting to meeting, searching for purpose he could not name. The portrait in his study, Eleanor in blue silk, remained locked in its frame, but sometimes he caught himself glancing at it, the way one glances at a ghost that insists on existing. At a dinner one winter evening, a colonel from Devon mentioned a small parish near the coast where he had recently attended a christening. "A curious thing," the man said, swirling his port. "A child baptized Edward Henry Ashbourne. The mother a lady of fine bearing, though her health looked delicate. Thought it odd, given the name." The laughter around the table faltered. The Duke's glass froze halfway to his lips. "Repeat that," Henry said softly. The colonel chuckled nervously. "Ashbourne, yes. Common name, I suppose." But Henry knew better. His breath thinned. He excused himself from the table, claiming fatigue, and left into the bitter cold. That night, the storm that had long slept in his conscience awakened with violent clarity. In his chamber, he searched the desk drawers until he found the miniature portrait again. The candlelight made her eyes shimmer, alive once more. He remembered how she used to wait for him at the garden gates, cheeks flushed from the wind. He had believed her softness weakness. Now he saw it for what it had been, strength of another kind. "Edward Henry," he whispered, tasting the name as if it were an accusation. 2 days later, he sent a discreet inquiry to Devon under the guise of a state inspection. The reply came swiftly, a parish record confirming the child's baptism, the mother's name written in an unmistakable hand, Eleanor Ashbourne. The ink was steady, the script delicate. He stared at it until the letters blurred. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had an air. Guilt struck him like a physical blow, followed swiftly by longing, an ache so unfamiliar it frightened him. He thought of the boy, his face, his laughter. Was he tall? Did he have her smile? Did she hate him? These questions became a fever. For days he avoided his mother, fearing the instinct in her eyes that read every secret. When at last she cornered him, her tone carried the sharp edge of suspicion. "You've been absent in thought, Henry," she said, arranging violets in a vase. "A duke should not look haunted." "Perhaps a man should," he replied. She frowned. "Do not begin that sentimental nonsense. Your marriage was a mercy's undoing. Whatever specter lingers, let it stay buried." He met her gaze. "You buried a woman. I buried a heart." Her hand froze mid-arrangement, the petals trembling like frightened things. "Do not speak of her again." But he could not stop. That night, he summoned his steward and ordered his carriage made ready. "Devon," he said, his voice low. "We leave before dawn." The steward hesitated. "And the dowager, your grace?" "She will think it politics," Henry murmured. "Let her." The journey south took 2 days, rain shadowing every mile. Henry rode in silence, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing like a confession. The countryside blurred, hedgerows, bridges, villages smelling of peat and bread. Each turn of the wheel deepened his unease. He had faced generals and kings without trembling, yet the thought of seeing Eleanor again made his hands unsteady. By the time he reached Devon, dusk had fallen. The manor stood alone against the moor, its windows lit by candlelight, humble and inviting. He dismissed his driver and approached on foot. Through a parted curtain, he saw movement. Eleanor, seated by the hearth, reading aloud to a child perched upon her lap. The boy's laughter broke through the glass like music. For an instant Henry forgot to breathe. The child's hair glowed auburn in the firelight, his face, dear God, his own mirrored youth. He stepped closer, his heart a war drum. Eleanor turned slightly, sensing something beyond the room's warmth. Her profile caught the flame's glow, the same grace though tempered now by resilience. She had not vanished beneath shame as his mother had claimed. She had transformed it into quiet dignity. When she looked toward the window, Henry stepped back into the shadow, unwilling to be seen yet unable to leave. That night he took lodging at a nearby inn, pacing his chamber like a man condemned. Every instinct told him to go to her, to speak, to fall to his knees if he must. But how does one apologize for stealing a woman's future? How does one ask forgiveness for discarding love and finding it again only when it blooms elsewhere? Sleep eluded him. When dawn came, he sought out the parish chapel instead. The priest was an old man with gentle eyes. When Henry introduced himself under false name, the priest smiled knowingly. "We've had few visitors of your stature, sir. But I dare say you come seeking peace." "I come seeking truth," Henry answered. The priest led him to the small wooden registry, pages smelling of ink and salt air. "Here," he said, pointing to the entry. "Edward Henry Ashbourne, son of Eleanor Ashbourne. Father, unlisted." Henry traced the ink with his gloved finger. The handwriting was hers. He could see the steadiness, the quiet defiance of a woman who no longer needed permission to name her own child. The room seemed to tilt. He turned away, gripping the pew for balance. Outside, the sea roared, gray and endless. He leaned against the chapel wall and exhaled, his breath misting into the cold air. For the first time in years he prayed, not for victory, not for pride, but for the courage to face what he had broken. He mounted his horse and rode toward the manor again, rain beginning to fall. Each drop struck his coat like penance. The world blurred into motion and memory, the Parliament chamber, her pale lavender gown, the moment he'd chosen humiliation over love. As he approached the house, he saw smoke curling gently from the chimney, the faint laughter of a child floating through the open gate. He dismounted and stood still, rain dripping from his hat brim. From within came the sound of a woman singing softly, a lullaby he remembered, the same she had once sung when they still believed the future could be kind. Henry closed his eyes, listening. Then he took a slow step forward. He did not yet know whether forgiveness would greet him, or fury. But for the first time since that day in Parliament, the Duke of Ashbourne no longer feared judgment. He only feared being too late. Rain fell in a soft curtain as Henry dismounted before the manor gates. The air smelled of earth and seaweed, the sort of scent that clung to memory. For a long moment he stood still, staring at the flicker of light behind lace-curtained windows, unsure whether he had come as a penitent or a thief. Then, drawing his cloak closer, he strode to the door and knocked. The sound was hollow, echoing through stone like a heartbeat that no longer believed in mercy. When the door opened, it was not Eleanor who stood there, but Anne, the same maid who had once shadowed her mistress through every ballroom in London. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed swiftly by wariness. "Your Grace," she whispered, startled. "We were not told." "Tell her I must see her," Henry said quietly. "She is not receiving visitors." He hesitated, the words catching like thorns. "She will receive me." Anne's gaze softened. "It has been 5 years, my lord. The world thought you'd forgotten." "I did not forget," he murmured, voice roughened by regret. "I simply lacked the courage to remember." The maid hesitated, then stepped aside. "Very well. Wait in the drawing room." He entered. The space was modest. No gilded mirrors, no marble columns, only warmth, a small fire, worn carpets, the faint scent of lavender. On the mantel stood a row of seashells and a single miniature portrait of a child. Henry's throat tightened. He traced the frame with a trembling hand, then heard footsteps behind him. Eleanor stood in the doorway, pale as the mist that wreathed the moor. Time had refined her rather than dimmed her. The fragile beauty of youth had deepened into something rarer, quiet strength. She wore a simple gown of ivory wool, her hair pinned loosely, her face unreadable. For a long, breathless silence, they only looked at one another, as if the years between them were a chasm neither dared to cross. "Your Grace," she said at last, the title deliberate. "Eleanor," he replied softly. "Do not call me that. What else should I call the man who stood before Parliament and declared me unworthy?" Her tone was calm, but beneath it ran a tremor of restrained fury. He took a hesitant step forward. "I came not to reopen wounds but to ask for forgiveness." She laughed quietly, though it held no mirth. "Forgiveness? How efficient men are with that word. as though repentance were a coin they might spend when pride proves lonely. He winced. I deserve every cruelty you can summon. But I had to see him. Our son. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eleanor's hands tightened at her sides, then slowly unclenched. He is not a title to be reclaimed, she said. He is flesh and laughter and innocence. He knows nothing of the cruelty that built his name. I do not wish to take him from you, Henry said, his voice low, almost pleading. Only to see him. Once. She studied him for a long time, as if trying to discern the sincerity beneath his polished mask. At last she nodded toward the hallway. He is in the garden. Henry followed her through the corridor lined with watercolors. Her work, he realized, tender impressions of sea and sky. In the garden, a small boy knelt by the rose bushes, chasing raindrops with a stick. The sight stole Henry's breath. Edward's hair glowed auburn even in the gray light, his cheeks flushed with life. The boy looked up, saw the stranger, and smiled without hesitation. Good afternoon, sir, he chirped, voice bright as birdsong. Henry knelt, his heart shaking. Good afternoon, he managed. You like the rain? It makes the flowers brave, Edward said solemnly. Mama says they only bloom when they forgive the clouds. Eleanor, standing behind them, looked away. Henry's vision blurred. She is wise, he whispered. Edward tilted his head. You talk like Mama, he said. Are you her friend? Henry's mouth opened, then closed again. Once, he said softly. Long ago. The boy nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran off toward the pond. Henry rose slowly, turning to Eleanor. He is everything I could never be. Her expression wavered. He is everything you chose not to be. Rain began again, light as breath. Henry took a step closer, the ache in his chest too great to disguise. I thought strength meant perfection, he said. That love required obedience to society, to my mother, to duty. But when I stood in that hall and watched you bow before men unworthy of your tears, I began to die. It has taken me 5 years to realize I buried my soul with you. Eleanor's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. You speak now of love, but what I remember is silence. When I begged you to listen, you turned away. When I wept, you told me composure was a woman's crown. You left me to carry your name and your shame together. He bowed his head. I cannot undo what I was. But let me at least prove what I have become. And what are you now, Henry? He met her gaze, unflinching. A man who would trade every acre, every title, to earn a single day of your regard. For the first time her composure cracked. She turned away, walking toward the house. He followed but stopped when she said quietly, Do not make vows in rain. It flatters every fool. He smiled sadly. Then let me prove them in sunlight. Before she could respond, the sound of hooves broke through the drizzle. A carriage approached, black and gleaming, his mother's crest on the door. Eleanor stiffened. You brought her here? I did not, Henry said, startled. She must have followed. The Dowager Duchess descended, elegant and severe, her expression thunderous. So it is true, she hissed. You've degraded yourself again, Henry? Do you mean to parade this woman and her bastard before society? Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her son's shoulder. Enough, Henry said sharply, stepping between them. She ruined you once, the Dowager spat. Will you let her ruin your legacy? Henry turned on her, voice low and cold. My legacy stands before me. He looked toward Edward. And it is purer than any crown. The Dowager recoiled as if struck. You would forsake your house for her? For love, he said simply. And for the child who bears my name, whether you acknowledge him or not. Silence fell. The rain eased, leaving the air trembling with tension. The Dowager's lips thinned. Then Ashbourne shall end with you, she whispered and turned away. Her carriage wheels hissed through the mud as she vanished into the mist. Eleanor stared after her, pale with disbelief. Henry reached for her hand, but she pulled back, trembling. You've defied your mother, your parliament, your pride, she said softly. But do you even know what comes next? He took her hand anyway, gently but firmly. Yes. I learned to be what I should have been, your husband if you'll have me. For a heartbeat, the world held still, the roses bowed under rain, the sea roared faintly beyond the hills, and in the doorway little Edward watched, clutching a shell in his small fist. Eleanor's lips parted, her breath unsteady. You came too late once, Henry. Do not make me believe you'll stay only to leave again. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles, eyes dark with unspoken vows. I will not leave. The words trembled between them like something sacred. Then, as if the sky itself approved, A weak ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, falling upon their joined hands. Neither spoke again. The only sound was the child's laughter, bright and pure, as he called to them from the garden. "Mama, look! The flowers are forgiving the clouds again." Eleanor turned, her heart caught between past and possibility, and for the first time in years she did not feel alone. Morning rose over the Devon coast with a fragile light, pale and trembling upon the sea. The storm had passed, but its scent still lingered, salt, rain, and renewal. Within the manor, silence reigned, the kind that follows confession. Henry had not slept. He sat by the window of the guest chamber, still in the clothes from the night before, watching the first blush of dawn strike the water. Every muscle ached with exhaustion and hope. He had defied his mother, humbled himself before the woman he had once destroyed, and yet he did not know if forgiveness would bloom from the wreckage. Down the corridor, Eleanor stirred. She had dreamt of the old ballroom in London, the one where they had first met, and of her younger self twirling beneath chandeliers, radiant and unguarded. That girl, she thought, had died the moment Parliament sealed her shame in ink. But the woman who awoke now was different. Tempered, cautious, capable of mercy but unwilling to surrender it easily. She rose, drew her shawl tighter and looked into the nursery. Edward still slept, curled like a cherub beneath linen sheets. His innocence anchored her. His existence made every choice she faced feel sacred. By the hearth below, Henry heard soft footsteps. He turned as Eleanor entered, her hair loose, her expression unreadable. The morning light gilded her features with melancholy grace. "You are still here," she said quietly. "I told you I would not leave." She crossed the room, hands clasped before her. "Words are wind, Henry. They fill rooms but not lives." "I came to give more than words," he said, rising. "I came to give my name, not to you for it is already yours by right of heart, but to our son." She studied him with the stillness of a woman who had learned that trust must be earned, not begged for. "And what will you do when society mocks you? When the tongue sneers at the Duchess who grew too full, too human for their liking?" He smiled faintly. "Then let them mock. I have worn admiration before, it never kept me warm." Her breath caught. It was not the grand gesture she had expected, but its quiet sincerity disarmed her more deeply than any apology. He stepped closer. "Eleanor," he said softly, "when I think of that hall, the day I cast you away, I remember not your silence but your eyes. You looked at me as if you already knew I would regret it. And you were right. I have lived 5 years in the shadow of that look." She turned her face slightly as though the memory itself burned. "Do you imagine remorse repairs what pride destroyed?" "No," he whispered. "But perhaps love does." For a moment they simply breathed the same air, the silence between them trembling like glass. Then from the hall, Edward's laughter rang out, bright, unknowing. He tumbled into the room in his nightshirt, holding a wooden horse. "Mama." The sun came back. Eleanor knelt, smoothing his hair. "Yes, my love. The sun always returns even when we think it won't." Henry watched them, the vision of what he had long denied himself, and felt tears rise, unbidden. The boy looked up, curious. "You again?" he said cheerfully. "Mama, is he staying for breakfast?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Yes, I think he is." Edward grinned, satisfied, and raced away to tell Mrs. Holt. When he was gone, Henry exhaled a quiet, trembling laugh. "He accepts me faster than I deserve." "Children do not measure worth," she said softly. "Only presence." They ate together in the morning room, a strange, delicate peace settling between them. The scent of bread and honey mingled with the salt air drifting through open windows. Eleanor found herself watching Henry's hands, the same hands that had once signed away her life, now gentler, uncertain. He watched her too, marveling at the grace that had survived his cruelty. It was a silence full of memory, not distance. When the meal ended, Henry rose. "There is something I must do before the day grows old." He drew a small folded parchment from his coat, the same seal that had once marked their divorce. "This is the record of our separation, written by men who knew nothing of love. I have carried it like a brand upon my soul. Today I ask you to destroy it with me." Eleanor looked at the document, the red wax cracked by time. Every humiliation she had endured lived inside those folds, every whisper, every glance. Her pulse raced. "You would risk scandal again?" He nodded. "For once, I will risk something worthy." They went together to the garden, where the storm's rain still glistened on petals. Henry struck a match, and the flame quivered in the sea breeze. For a heartbeat he hesitated. Then he held it out. Eleanor took the parchment, her hand brushing his, and fed it to the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. Smoke rose in delicate spirals toward the gray-blue sky. "It is done," she murmured. Henry turned to her. "No. Now it begins." The words trembled through her like a vow. Yet before she could reply, the distant rumble of hooves broke the quiet. A messenger galloped through the gate, mud spattering his coat. He dismounted hastily, bowing low. "A letter, Your Grace. Urgent, from London." Henry frowned, breaking the seal. As his eyes scanned the page, his face paled. "My mother," he said slowly. "She has taken her grievance to the crown. She means to strip Edward of inheritance, to name another heir through petition." Eleanor's heart lurched. She would disown her own blood? She would see my line end rather than share it with the woman she despised. He looked at her then, a storm behind his eyes, not of rage but of resolve. "I will not let her erase him. Or you." Eleanor straightened, her fear burning into defiance. "Then we go to London," she said. "Not to plead but to stand." Henry stared at her, awe breaking through his grief. "You would face them again, the same men who mocked you?" She met his gaze. "I face childbirth alone. Parliament cannot frighten me." For a heartbeat, he said nothing, only looked at her as if seeing her anew, not the Duchess he'd discarded, but the woman who had endured and transformed. Then he bowed his head. "You shame me with your strength. You taught me to live without your protection," she said softly. "Now you must learn to stand beside mine." That night, as they prepared to leave, Edward stood in the doorway clutching his wooden horse. "Are we going on an adventure?" he asked sleepily. Eleanor smiled, kneeling to kiss his brow. "Yes, my darling. To make the world remember your name." When he slept, Henry lingered by the fire. "She will fight us," he said. "Every whisper, every law." Eleanor placed a hand over his. "Then let them whisper. History remembers courage longer than scandal." Outside, thunder rumbled again over the sea, but this time it sounded almost like applause. The coach waited by the gate, lanterns swaying. Henry turned to her as she climbed in, the wind catching the edges of her cloak. "Eleanor," he murmured, "when this is done, when they've heard your voice, I will ask you once more what I should have asked long ago." She met his eyes, calm and knowing. "Then I shall answer what I could not before." The horses surged forward, wheels cutting through the mist. Behind them, the manor faded into the horizon. Ahead lay London, and judgment, but also something greater than either, the chance to write love, not law, as the final word of the House of Ashbourne.